So now that we introduced you into the idea of, teaming and partnering and research institutions, in part two here, we're going to talk about how do you connect with those research institutions. So real quick definition for you, research institutions are organizations that receive funding, typically, or actually always, by the federal government to actually do research activities. So a lot of times those are things like universities or federally funded research and development labs, or development centers, FFRDCs, and things like Sandia National Labs, Los Alamos National Labs, Air Force Research Labs. So they're organizations that are doing research typically for the government. That's kind of where that idea and definition of a research institution comes from. And partnering or teaming with research institutions can lead to some really great development opportunities. They have a lot of expertise, they have a lot of technical capability, and they have a lot of access to, frankly, facilities or equipment that you might not without paying multiple millions of dollars for. But when you look at entering an arrangement with one of those research institutions, there's a couple things that you should be aware of. So research institutions typically move at a different pace. They move at a much slower pace than businesses. And that's because, from a small business perspective, maybe you're the CEO and owner. Maybe there's only one person making decisions. Maybe you have a team of 3 people. It's really easy for you to execute a contract. But research institutions have bureaucracy. Just like the government, they have steps and protocols they have to go through. So there could be a lot of documentation they have to set up. Could be a lot of signatures and authorizations they need. And you kind of need to keep in mind when you're going to approach one of these research institutions that sometimes it can take them a while to get that because they do have to move through that bureaucratic process. Rather than hours or days, sometimes it can take weeks or months for them to get that. So just be aware that it's not really that if you come to them and you say, hey, I got this due in a week, I'd really like to work with you, more than likely you're going to get turned down. And it's not that they don't want to work with you. It's they know they can't get the documentation in place that needs to be in place before that deadline is going to come up and expire. So whenever you are approaching them, keep in mind a couple of these key facts. A lot of times there are going to be some key forms and data you have to either fill out or provide to them before they can even start a partnership request. And when you are coming to them with that, have some basic facts or tenets in your back pocket. So why are you coming to them? Is it because you want to license a piece of technology from them? Is it because you need, research help? And remember what we talked about last time, it's the same exact setup for when you're looking at teaming. Come to them with a goal in mind. Kind of have an idea of exactly what you need. Have an idea if you do need access to equipment and labs. If you need access to those, well, sometimes that documentation can take longer to get. Maybe they have to go through other organizations for authorizations. Maybe that piece of equipment that you want access to is supposed to only be accessible by federal employees. There can be very strict rules and requirements for how you can access those facilities or if they allow people to access those facilities. What is that time commitment? Remember the scope. What do you actually need from them? How long do you expect them to be able to work on this? And also with that kind of time commitment, it's also the time commitment just by the calendar. So when is this going to go in? When do you expect this to get funded? When will the work stop? If you need a particular researcher, they might have a research project that conflicts with that schedule. Kind of keep that in mind, is even if you can get access to them, even if you get everything set up, if schedule-wise it doesn't work, you're not going to get that person. Maybe you'll get a postdoc researcher. Maybe you'll get the, fellow. Maybe there's somebody else that's going to be there, but they have their own research projects. They have their own work. That's why they're being funded, at least in part, by the government to do research. So know not only how long it's going to take, but just what is that general schedule? What is that time-wise schedule? Is there something that, they need to do that's towards the end of the project rather than the beginning? Is it something that's going to fall in the middle and take 6 months? Have that kind of thing. You don't have to have it cemented, in stone, but at least have a general idea. Have a basis you can bring to them. Have something they can actually wrap their hands around and go, okay, let me see what we have. Let me see what our schedules are like. Let me see what our research is like. Let me see what our projects are like. And sometimes maybe it's a conflict of interest for them. Maybe they're working on something similar. Maybe they've been funded by another company to actually do research in that area. Just contractually, they might not be able to do that. And that's why it's so important to approach these types of organizations as early as possible. You can never be too early as long as you have these ideas in place. If you come to them with no ideas, no, scope, no sense of what you're going to need from them, they're not really going to be able to help you out. Now, if you do manage to work it out with them and they can be part of the effort, keep in mind that you're going to need a letter of commitment from them. And that's also something that takes time. So let them know early exactly what you're going to need. Are you going to need a separate budget from them? Is it going to have to be in a certain format? Are you going to need, extraneous forms like current and pending support, or collaborators and other affiliations? Know what you need for that proposal package at that very first meeting, because then that gives them time to actually get it. It gives them time to generate it. It gives them time to work through their own processes. Also, keep aware of that thing we talked about before with that kind of division of the work. What are your numbers you can bring? What can they actually do? What type of funding can you give them? And a lot of times it's easier just to give them a flat rate or a flat figure than it is to give them a percentage. If you tell them they can have 33% of the award, well, that doesn't do much for them. If you tell them, well, I'm going to request $256,000, and on your side, you just can't make the numbers work. That's going to throw off their calculations. That's going to throw off their budget. That's going to throw off the numbers they generated. And then they might have to regenerate them, which might have to get authorized again. It might have to go through that bureaucratic process. So a lot of times it behooves both of y'all to come in with just that. I can give you $100,000 for this level of work. I can give you $100,000 to do these things. It can make both your life and their lives a lot easier when it comes down to it. And if you are doing this for an STTR, kind of keep in mind that there might be other documentation that's needed. Most agencies, in fact, pretty much all of them, for an STTR are going to require a model rights agreement. So if there is intellectual property that's being shared, if there's intellectual property that's being co-developed, if there's intellectual property that's going to come out of this project, how's it going to be shared between the organizations? You don't have to have these set in place at the time of submission, but you're going to have an authorized one before any of these agencies will give you one red cent. They want to make sure that this isn't just going to devolve into an intellectual property fight down the line. So some research institutions might actually use a term of a CRADA instead, a Cooperative Research and Development Agreement. And for your purposes, a CRADA is very similar to that Model Rights Agreement. It's going to describe what's going to happen, how it's going to be collaborative, how y'all are going to grow it, if there's any split. Keep in mind, though, that most research institutions don't really want to generate IP. They already have their own. They're dealing with all of that stuff. So it's not like you're just giving up the ghost. If it's something that y'all develop together, there's always negotiations. You can negotiate for a better split. You can negotiate for them to actually potentially pay for the patenting cost. So that is usually gone over in that agreement. And before you approach any of these research institutions, it's a good idea to actually pull one up. If you search for Model Rights Agreement and agency name, so Model Rights Agreement NIH or Model Rights Agreement NASA, they're going to show you what their templates look like. So dive through that. Figure it out. What does it actually state? What's important in there? How do y'all move through that? Kind of what do y'all focus on? That'll give you some wiggle room when you do get to the table and y'all do have to start hashing that out. Is there anything you can offer them instead? It can be kind of a pain, but it's just the SBIR and STTR agencies making sure that once the project is funded, once this phase 1 or phase 2 is funded, that down the line there's not going to be a legal battle between you and the institution. One thing to keep in mind, though, is no matter what, it doesn't matter if the institution that you're making the subaward to is Harvard. On an SBIR and an STTR, even if, on an STTR they're getting 60% of the budget, the award is still with the small business. The small business is, for lack of a better word, in control of that arrangement. They're in control of that agreement. They're in control of the work. That's really important to kind of keep in mind, because ultimately that means also that this is your responsibility to make sure it happens. It's your responsibility to make sure the project moves forward. It's your responsibility to make sure there's no hurdles or hiccups. Remember, these programs are for growing businesses. They're not for growing universities. They're not for growing FFRDCs. They're for growing businesses so that they can bring innovative ideas to the commercial market. That means that the small business has to handle the finances, reporting, workloads. You have to make the payments. You have to coordinate the parties. You have to coordinate, the metrics. You have to coordinate the reporting requirements. At the end of the day, you're the bus driver. They're along for the ride, but you are driving that bus. You're planning that route. You're getting them to the destination. And we'd be remiss if we didn't give you some, potential people or potential research institutions to actually reach out to across New Mexico. These are some really great points of contact, well, as of this recording. So if you're watching this 3 years from now and I'm no longer around, make sure that you reach out to the NMFAS program and ask, are these still active? Are these people still valid? But the organizations are going to continue to be there, barring some sort of post-apocalyptic nightmare wasteland we're living in. But across New Mexico, there's a lot of really great research institutions, a lot of them that can bring really, world-class expertise, experience, facilities, equipment to bear. Don't hesitate to reach out. But again, before you reach out, make sure you have those ideas in hand. Make sure you know what you're going to need. Make sure you know what you're going to request of them. Otherwise, it's really hard to get that conversation and that ball started. And when you are reaching out to them, not only have that in mind, but also know that if you haven't already started talking with a researcher or a potential person that you want to bring in their expertise, if you know what you need but you don't know who brings it to the table, there are departments within these organizations that can help you. A lot of times at the universities, it's going to be like the intellectual property office or an economic development office. They have their finger on the pulse of what's going on, who can we leverage, who has that experience and expertise, who has done similar research. Or for an FFRDC, it's going to be their tech transfer office. It's going to be the people that are trying to push technology into the hands of others. It's going to be people that are trying to transition that. It's going to be the people that really want to be able to push what they have for licensing and commercialization. They're going to be your best bet for being able to find researchers. We hope that was a really good, just kind of general introduction into how do you communicate with the research institution? How do you potentially work with them? What do you need to keep in mind before you approach them? Remember, give them plenty of lead whenever you want to connect with them. Kind of give them plenty of timing before that proposal package is due. Have some ideas about what you're going to need and the amount of budget that can be put towards it. Sometimes it may not be enough budget for them to bring in that type of personnel. Sometimes it may be plenty. You will never know until you reach out to them and you kind of are able to give them that figure and give them that scope of work. And sometimes maybe it's something that can be negotiated. But have those ideas in hand before you reach out. You're going to have a much more productive conversation if you do.